A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, at magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. Wherever you're located, any part of the world, this is your hour, and this is Rita Gadi. Last week, we were going over the past, and several, episodes that happened then, we were trying to recall. How long ago was it? Can you imagine? Gaano katagal ko na ba kilala si President Ferdinand Marcos, si Mrs. Imelda Romualdez Marcos, yung kanilang pamilya. Nabanggit ko nga nung nakaraang linggo, it all began when I was first covering the presidential campaign sometime in 1965. There was only, just a few of us actually na kasama noon sa pag-ikot sa buong Pilipinas. That was the time when President Marcos moved over to the Nacionalista Party. He was a liberal all throughout his political years prior to his running for the presidency. He was expecting that the incumbent president then, President Macapagal, would be supporting him because I think that was the earlier conversation. But President Macapagal, who was the incumbent, decided that he wanted to run for re-election. So with President Marcos mapping out already his vision to be the president of the republic, he had no choice but to transfer to the Nacionalista Party. At the time, the candidates for the Nacionalista Party were already set. The grand old man, as they called him, si Eulogio Rodriguez, was the party president, chairman, and the king of the Nacionalista Party, and they already had choices. They had Emmanuel Pelaez, they had Gil Puyat, and several others. And so it was difficult now for President Marcos at the time to enter the Nacionalista Party. But since they had conventions, you see at the time, and that's what we should have today, they had a national convention for both parties, separately, of course. And in the convention, they would choose from among all of those that were interested to run who it was they were going to pinagbobotohan, in other words. So lahat ng mga interesadong tumakbo, pagka-presidente at kasama rin niya yung kanyang vice president, papasok dyan sa convention at yan ay may bilangan din ng boto. It was also done by secret balloting. So President Marcos took his oath of office with Senator Roy at the time. He was accompanied by Senator Laurel, and then of course Eulogio Rodriguez was a little unnerved about it kasi may mga kandidato na nga sila. As a matter of fact, between Pelaez and Puyat and the others, malaki na yung mga tsansa nito mga taong ito sa botohan. But when President Marcos joined in the Nacionalista Party, in the first voting they had, incidentally that was held at the Manila Hotel, the old Manila Hotel, which you still see up to this day. So nung karoon sila ng botohan, nag-tie, 7-7, I think, pare-pareho yung boto. Kaya there had to be another set of voting. At that time, the reason why we were covering this was because our delegation from Mindanao, coming from Cotabato, we had 10 delegates, meaning 10 yung mga miyembro ng Nacionalista Party that will be voting in that convention. And my father was the one in charge of these 10 people coming from Cotabato. At the time, Cotabato was still one big province. Wala pang yung mga probinsyang lima na ngayon sa kasalukuyan. But at the time, isa lang yan. In fact, it was the biggest province in the entire country. So because it was the biggest province, it had 10 delegates. So there was another set of voting at the Manila Hotel kasi nga nag-tie first voting. And sure enough, after the second voting, it was Marcos who won in that convention. So he was the proclaimed official candidate of the Nacionalista Party. Ang kagandahan nito ay galing siya sa liberal. And as far as the Liberal Party was concerned, he was really one of the best they had. an outstanding congressman, an outstanding senator, and he was also Senate president. So they felt that some of them, even though they did not shift parties, they were supportive of President Marcos. In fact, marami dun sa mga political leaders at the time all over the country, when he went out to campaign in the different provinces and regions, lahat sila nag-pledge ng support kay President Marcos, even though ibang partido. Remember, at the time, dalawa lang yung parties, nationalista and liberal. But as I've said, since Marcos is a former liberal, many of the liberal candidates also supported him. Kaya ang laki ng margin ng kanyang pagkapanalo when he ran in that presidential election. So that is how far back I go on a personal and professional basis as far as knowing the Marcoses are concerned. So you can imagine how it was then. I was not yet qualified to vote because the voting age was 21 years. And I was not 21 yet at the time. So hindi pa ako bumoboto, pero kasama na ako in some of the provinces during the campaign. It was quite exciting because at that time, wala pang cellphone. We had radios, malalaking radyo yun. And the method of communication then was by telegram. So moving from one town to the other really needed a lot of communication skills, so to speak. But that was already set. The political parties had their own machinery. And of course, President Marcos had his own nationwide machinery already set because remember, when he ran for the Senate, he already established all the connections for the different provinces and cities. At the time, talagang mahalaga yung personal appearance. There were rallies in towns and in the provincial capitals, and people anticipated the arrival of the candidates. Talagang mano-mano, they had to be there, they would speak on stage, and they would go down and shake hands with the people. That was how hectic it was, how interesting, and also how exciting. I had a map of the Philippines at the time, and for every province that we visited, I wrote the names of the incumbent politicians or the politicians at the time, the leaders of the Liberal and the Nationalista Party, with whom President Marcos met, so that I had the record of this. I just don't have it right now. But if I go over that listing, one thing that is quite notable is the fact that yung mga pangalan at apelido ng panahon na yon, imagine 1965, ganun pa rin yung mga pangalan na nakikita natin sa kasalukuyan. In other words, the transference of the political power and perhaps all of those what you call dynasties have been moving from one generation to the other. Ganun talaga. Kung hindi yung asawa, yung anak, yung kamag-anak, but you had the same names. Anyway, that was then, 1965. But last week, ang pinag-usapan ko, yung sinasabi nga natin going back to the past and so forth, ito na yung pag-alis na ni President Marcos sa Malacanang. I was mentioning how over the election period in 1986, nagkaroon ng snap elections noong February 7, and the counting was done within the week, and then there was a proclamation that was undertaken at the Batasang Pambansa, and in the proclamation, even though they segregated what they believe were questionable canvassing votes that were canvassed. Kahit na nga nahiwalay na yon, panalo pa rin si President Marcos, and he immediately took his oath of office inside Malacanang. What we see on television, or what we saw on television, that he was on the balcony and he was waving to the people and he took his oath there, that was only for the public to see that he actually was taking his oath as president. But that was the sad part about it, because as you've said, Washington has already arranged for his removal. As a matter of fact, nakwento ko na rin yun, ang daming mga opisyal na nanggagaling sa State Department under George Shultz and several others, mga former ambassadors and former officials who went to the Philippines, who went here to us and met with President Marcos and tried to convince him to step down and so forth. Pero sabi nga ni President Marcos, you cannot tell me how I can run my country better than I can. So whatever it is, na-mention ko na rin yung mga pangalan na nagpunta doon. You will remember Senator Laxalt, siya yung sinulat niya, it came out in Washington also. He wrote about his conversations with President Marcos. You had Ambassador Habib Philip Habib, who also came. He was formerly ambassador in the Middle East. He was trying to do some work in Lebanon, in, well, several countries in the Middle East. In Vietnam, he also was there at one time. But he was not successful in all of his diplomatic vision. But then he came here and spoke to President Marcos. He was one of those that was also sent. So marami yan. Several of them na walang ginawa kundi kausapin nga si President Marcos. But be that as it may, it was actually Senator Laxalt who finally told President Marcos on the phone, you really have to cut and cut clean. Why? Because that was the decision already made in Washington. Ganun talaga kabigat ang influence ng State Department sa mga bansang kagaya ng Pilipinas, lalong-lalo na kung gusto nila na magkaroon ng regime change. That has been then in the past and it continues in the present. Although, as they say, that medyo humihina na yung kanilang influence, but you still have yung mga galamay, kanilang tentacles that are really moving in countries where they really want to change either the head of state, the head of government, or some other officials that they want removed. That's the way it goes. The Philippines is the only colony of America. And be that as it may, kahit na 45 years sila nag-colonize dito sa atin, they still feel, even up to this day, na parang hawak pa rin tayo sa leeg. Remember how President Duterte was actually showing, making a graphic description of how we are tied like a dog on a leash and hihilahin pagka medyo hindi nila gusto yung paglakad. So that's how it goes. But we have to accept the reality that's geopolitics. A lot of statements being made that we have an independent foreign policy, etc. Pero talagang pagka kumikilos na yung doon sa Kapitolyo ng Amerika, talagang nagkakaroon ng ripple effect dito sa atin. It's sad, and we're hoping that eventually there could really be an independent foreign policy to be pursued. Marcos did this as best as he could. Remember, without the go signal of Washington, he opened diplomatic ties with enemies of America, such as the Soviet Union at the time, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and also of the People's Republic of China, and of course opening other diplomatic relations with Arab countries and opening talks and negotiations and even having an agreement with Libya, for that matter, another enemy of the United States. So that's the way countries supposedly interrelate with each other. But balikan natin yung aking kwento last week. Sabi ko nga, itutuloy ko sa kasalukuyan. So, from Malacanang, and that was about 7:30, I think, in the evening, when they had to cross the Pasig River. I even read portions of my diary on that day to you will recall. So what happened was they crossed the Pasig River, and on the other side, dun sa presidential security grounds, there were several helicopters there. These are no longer Philippine helicopters, American helicopters. Dinala sila sa Clark Air Base. And that was when it was, Marcos believed that from Clark Air Base, they will be brought to Hawaii, which is his hometown, his home province, his home city, because that was the agreement that they had, and that was what he told Senator Paul Laxalt, that if he's leaving Malacanang, doon na lang siya sa Ilocos dalahin. But that did not happen because while they were there in Clark, they got there maybe about 8, 9 o'clock in the evening. Very early the following day, that was about, according to them, about 4 o'clock in the morning, hindi pa sumisikat ang araw, they were wakened by the base commander in Clark, and they were told that they had to move away, they had to vacate, they had to evacuate from Clark because this another crazy reason, really. Pinaligiran daw ng mga komunista ang Clark Air Base. Can you imagine? Thousands of hectares mapapaligiran at the time ng mga komunista kasi andun si Marcos. Well, it was a lame excuse. But what could you do? You were you were at the mercy of the Americans in Clark, and so they had to leave. And from Clark, they were brought to Guam, and from Guam, they were brought to Honolulu. So yun na yung travel ng mga Marcoses from Malacanang to Clark, and from Clark to Guam, and from Guam to Honolulu. Pero maraming kaibigan naman si President Marcos sa mga officials ng ng Amerika. And we saw on television, perhaps those of you would remember this, when he arrived in Honolulu, sinalubong din siya ng governor doon at mga other officials ng Hawaii. And well, in the beginning, they were billeted at the other half of the quarters of the base commander. Parang sinasabi nga na hindi pa alam kung saan sila dadalahin. So when they got there, what happened was there was another airplane that also carried their luggages. And yun na nga, meron pang natirang mga pera sa Malacanang na hindi nagamit nung pagkampanya ni Marcos. And that was on board another aircraft. Hindi yan kasabay ng kanilang pagdating. Kaya pag sinasabi sa media that they smuggled in pesos to Hawaii, hindi totoo yun. Because ang bit-bit lang nila, yung kanilang nadala lang dun sa first aircraft nung dumating sila sa Honolulu. Some documents, but not all the documents that they had in Malacanang, yun ang kinwento ko sa inyo, ang dami nilang mga naiwan doon na hindi na binitbit whatever it is that they brought along. Pagdating sa HICAM, which is the air base in Honolulu, kinonfiscate ito. Anything that they saw of any relevance for whatever it is that they believed it would be relevant for, kinuha nila. And most of these were documents. Kaya sabi nga natin, kung ano man yung mga dala nila mga papeles, whether they are accounts or whether they're savings or whether they're important documents, wala na sa kanila. Kinuha yan ng mga Amerikano doon sa HICAM. At yung mga naiwan nila sa Malacanang, well, nakwento ko na rin kung sino mga pumasok dyan. Right after they left, you had Joker Arroyo, who became the executive secretary of Corazon Aquino, together with a certain Ponciano Roque. Silang dalawa ang pumasok sa Malacanang. Sabi nga, yung chafing dishes, kung saan may mga pagkain pa, mainit pa. In other words, kaalis lang nila President Marcos noon. But anyway, the documents there, some were picked up by Potenciano Roque and the Joker Arroyo. And there was one safe in the study, at the back of the study room of the president, but the combination was actually written out of, pasted out of sa labas nung safe na yon. They opened it. At doon nga, nakwento ko na rin ito, may nahanap na isang bag of diamonds. At sabi nila, binigay daw yan kay Mrs. Aquino. Maybe it's there in the central bank, maybe it's somewhere, we don't know. But whatever it is, naghalungkat din ng mga papeles yung si Potenciano Roque. The following morning, you had this group of ladies, mga barkada, mga kamadyong, Mrs. Aquino. They also entered Malacanang. And curious sila kasi maybe that was the first time they entered and they wanted to see how it was. Sila naghalungkat din. So what they did was, kasi maraming maleta pang naiwan doon, they started gathering documents and papers and putting them in boxes, putting them inside suitcases. But when they got there, they saw Mrs. Margarita Cojuangco, asawa ng kapatid ni Mrs. Aquino. So she was coming down already with her own treasures from Malacanang. And according to the testimony of Angelita Reyes, who was one of those that entered Malacanang in the morning, yung mga dala ni Mrs. Cojuangco pababa, sabi niya there were several suitcases. Nung tinanong siya anong laman ng mga maleta na yon, hindi siya makasagot ng tuwid. Ang sabi niya, non-documents. So ano kaya yon? Mga purtina? Anyway, so whatever it is, alam na natin kung ano yon, because according to the money trail and the paper trail and whatever it is that they got from Malacanang, they deposited this at the Central Bank of the Philippines. So whether some suitcases were brought elsewhere, we have no record of that. We only know what the records speak of as far as testimonies are concerned, and that is Angelita Reyes who mentioned that Tingting Cojuangco brought out several suitcases and they contained non-documents. That was her exact statement at the New York trial when there was already the trial going on in New York City. So that was how the procedure was. Yung pag-alis ng mga Marcoses at kung saan sila umabot. Pagdating nila sa Hawaii, sabi ko nga, doon sila tumira sa bahay, sa kalahati ng tinitirhan ng base commander. Hanggang sa makahanap sila ng mas magandang tirahan because there in the base itself, my goodness, sabi nga nila, nilagyan ng yellow cord several meters around that place para walang makakalabas, walang makakapasok. As a matter of fact, anybody would want to visit, well, they were very strict regarding that. You had to be fingerprinted, photographed, you had to write down all the data regarding you and your interest in visiting the Marcoses. Mga nakapasok na mga Philippine officials, as I've said, you had General Almonte, nakapasok siya doon, and several others who were also trying to find out how they can get the money of President Marcos. So they were allowed there sa base commander. Doon pa lang sa base pumasok na sila, and that was that big adventure that they had, if you would call it. But actually, it was a process of trying to retrieve the assets of President Marcos overseas, and they gave it a name, Operation Big Bird. Kung ano man yung Big Bird na yun na naaalala ninyo sa Sesame Street, maybe they thought of naming it Big Bird because they were saying something like they were trying to retrieve several billions of dollars in assets of the Marcoses. Pero hindi natuloy yun sapagkat sabi ko nga nagkaroon ng, paano ba yung masasabi, nagkaroon ng hindi naman away na malaki, pero ayaw ni Joker Arroyo, ayaw ng mga ibang mga tao sa Malacanang, hindi maintindihan kung ano na nangyari. Sabi ni Mrs. Aquino, wag na ituloy. There was the Secretary of Justice, the Secretary Ordonez, and there was General Almonte, na silang dalawa ang nagpapalakad niyan. Pero sabi ni Joker Arroyo, wag daw gawin. So hindi natuloy, but they came out with several, I don't know if that is official, but they came out with certain amounts kung ano daw yung kanilang hahabulin o kukunin dun sa mga bank accounts ng mga Marcoses. So we don't know whether they were actually able to get this through the Swiss authorities or it really fizzled out. But that was the Operation Big Bird. So again, from the base quarters where the Marcoses were billeted temporarily at the time, they were transferred to a small bungalow along there's just one highway lang kasi yan sa Honolulu. Those of you who have been there, that's the main highway. You call it the Kalaniani-Ole Highway. And the bungalow where the Marcoses were brought was right there along that highway. Kaya ang ingay-ingay, madidinig daw yung mga daan ng mga sasakyan because that was the only big long highway in Honolulu. In fact, you can go around the island just passing through that highway, Kalaniani-Ole anyway. So doon sila unang tinira. At maraming taong talagang medyo may kabastusan din. They were throwing garbage over the fence when they knew that the Marcoses were staying there. But there were also hundreds of people who came to visit, yung mga Ilocano, what they call the old-timers. They settled there in the 50s, maybe even earlier. They've had their families there. They were already American citizens. Maraming Ilocano, and they came to visit. They brought little things, nagdala ng house needs, tissue, etc. And they brought slippers and sapatilla for Mrs. Marcos. They brought, of course, Ilocano food, Ilocano dishes. Yon, ang daming bumisita at the time. But other than that, there were also visitors coming from the Immigration Bureau of America. The Marcoses were issued what we now know as the parole visa. Ibig sabihin nun, hindi permanent visa kasi kinonfiscate yung kanilang mga passports. So they had no passports. So they were given a visa, nakalagay dun sa visa nila parang distinguished guest or something like that. Pero they were required to report to the immigration office regularly. Si Marcos, hindi naman pinapareport na, but every once in a while, binibisita siya ng mga tao sa immigration at yung mga taga-Justice Department sa kanilang mga offices doon, just to check na hindi siya nag-escape from Honolulu. Can you imagine that? How many thousands of nautical miles Honolulu is from the Philippines or from Ilocos? Anyway, after that, they were able to arrange, kasi may bahay ang mga Marcoses doon, 2 bahay. Nasa taas yun ng bundok, yung tinatawag nilang Makiki Heights. There were 2 houses there. sa pinakamataas, dun nang ginamit yung quarters ng mga kasama nila, yung mga security and the household and the nurses that came with the Marcoses to Honolulu. And then yung isang bahay na merong view of Honolulu, nakikita yung lahat sa beach and the ocean. That was where they resided, yung sa Makiki Heights. It's a beautiful, parang villa. It looked like some kind of a Mexican villa. Matagal na yung bahay na yon. As a matter of fact, we've seen that on several occasions when President Marcos was one time invited sa Honolulu when he was president to address a group of journalists, and there was a press conference. That was also where he stayed. So we've seen that place, and it was cleaned and fixed, and well, and whatever it is, they had all the different connections for electricity and water that were installed, and so that was where the Marcoses stayed for all the years until President Marcos died also in Honolulu. So 1986, kanilang pag-alis, doon sila dinala from Hicam Air Base to Canalani Aniole, that bungalow there, and then to Makiki Heights. And that was where all of these documents and complaints and cases were given to Marcos. Ang daming mga kaso na pinatong sa kanya. And that is why the question goes, bakit hindi siya nilitis dito sa Pilipinas? Because those are criminal cases, and they were using the criminal law of America to indict them. As I said, I mentioned already, one of the most controversial of it was the RICO case. That was the only law they could find that they could file against Marcos, kasi hindi naman pwedeng sabihin na graft and corruption, because all of that will have to be tried here in our country. So in order to have jurisdiction over the person of President Marcos, yung ginamit nila yung RICO law, which is the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. Napakatindi ng batas na yon, kasi yung sumulat niyan, ang sabi nga niya, kaya niya ginawa yung batas na yan, that was for the underworld, yung mga gangs, yung mga mafia, yung mga godfather, yung mga ganon. Because racketeering, influenced and corrupt organizations. Ibig sabihin yung mga smugglers, yung mga naghahandle ng prostitution, lahat, the underworld, the sleazy Balzacian underworld. That was what that law is all about. And can you imagine, the President of the Republic of the Philippines, a war-decorated hero, one of the finest lawyers we have, who topped the bar when he took the bar, who defended himself and got his acquittal, even though he was not yet a lawyer at the time. That was Ferdinand Marcos. And then to be accused of having violated that Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Act. Just to give you an idea of how brilliant Ferdinand Marcos was when he took the bar in 1939, I'm sorry. It was an unprecedented record. Yung kanyang grades nakuha niya sa bar. Sa criminal law, 100%. International law, 100%. Legal ethics, 100%. Civil law, 98%. Procedural law, 97%. Commercial law, 97%. Tapos political law, 95%. Yung kanyang general average was 98.01%. Wala pa naka-break ng record na ito. In fact, nagulat nga yung mga members of the Supreme Court that gave the test to the bar examinees at the time. They were suspecting baka nagdaya si Marcos. So they called him in the Supreme Court, and sabi nga ni Marcos sa mga Supreme Court justices, if you're suspecting that I cheated, why don't you test me here right now? So, in front of you. And sabi nga, yung ibang grades niya dito, in a 100%, but tumaas pa in front of the justices as he was being tested orally there, or perhaps even written, just to make sure that he did not cheat, to have been able to get such averages. But I'm going back to this precisely because yan ang kanilang in-indict dyan sa Amerika, sapagkat nagkaroon ng deal. ang Philippine government at saka ang Justice Department ng Amerika, yung kanilang Attorney General, yung Assistant Attorney General, Deputy, as you would call it, si Victoria Tensing, at saka si Jovito Salonga, na meron silang pinirmahan na parang Memorandum of Agreement na kung ano man yung mga dokumento meron sa Amerika, at kung ano man yung mga dokumento na meron makukuha nila sa Pilipinas, magagamit sa kaso na yan, they will have this exchange of documents. And America also entered into some kind of an agreement with the Swiss government, also regarding whatever documents the Swiss government would supply the American government regarding the cases that they filed against the Marcoses there in the United States. So yung mga unang kaso na pinahil nila dyan sa LA at saka eventually yung human rights case sa Honolulu. But let's get back again to what happened sa Makiki Heights. Ang kasama nila President Marcos were the close-in security at yung dalawang aide-de-camp ni President Marcos, si Azurin at saka si Arovisa. They stayed with him until I think Azurin was able to have his family join him, and it was Arovisa who stayed there with Marcos until the trial and until Marcos died also there in Honolulu in 1989. And then the close-in security, kasama rin silang lahat, the household, and the nurses. Kasi usually pagka, of course, all of you know this, that the very important persons, presidents, vice president, our officials, especially the high officials, heads of state and heads of government, talagang meron silang grupo na nag-aalaga sa kanila, hindi lang yung household, hindi lang yung butler, hindi lang yung food taster or security, kasama rin nila mga nurses, mga doctors, personal doctors, para kasama yon sa contingent. So they were all there in Honolulu sa Makiki Heights, and sabi ko nga, it's a beautiful house. Parang Mediterranean in a way, or Mexican, whatever it is, blue tiled, and there was a swimming pool, may bougainvillea na gumagapang doon sa poste na papunta sa lanay. It's an orange bougainvillea, talas ng memory ko. And then you had little yellow flowers around the swimming pool. And I think there was a big champaka tree. You know what it is? Yung champaka. Ang bango-bango niyan. Ang laki ng puno na andon na mataas, umaabot yung mga bulaklak at yung amoy, the scent, you could smell it from the second floor where the Marcos room was, and then also in the balcony in the second floor. Mrs. Barba, kapatid ni President Marcos, Fortuna Barba, we call her Tita Baby. She also lived there in that house together with bang kasama nila doon? Well, President and Mrs. Marcos, and then Baby Barba. Every once in a while, sabi ko nga, pagka nakakadalaw kami, nakakabisita kami doon sa bahay na yon. Napakagandang lugar talaga. At alam naman ninyo, ang Honolulu is really almost like a paradise, if you would call it. You had the trade winds, and the climate was just perfect. And then you had rainbows every day. Not one, not two, not three, 5 of them sometimes at any one time. Then you could see the Diamond Head Mountain, of course, the open ocean. You could see it from that height and the rest of the city. It was a beautiful place. Kaya sabi ko nga, kahit na anong kalungkutan ang nadama ng mga Marcoses doon, well, at least the environment was such that it was a beautiful place. And that was where they received visitors who came. Pero ang daming takot bumisita. Sapagkat ang nangyari doon, pagka dumadalaw sa mga Marcoses, nililista yung mga pangalan na yan ng FBI at ng Justice Department at ng Immigration, at iniimbestiga nila yung mga kabuhayan ng mga taong bumibisita kasi baka nagdadala ng pera o naglalabas ng pera o may baka dalang dokumento o baka may mga planong masama. Talagang grabe ang pagsubaybay. They were really under strict security. Yung kaibigan ni President Marcos, yung kagolf niya dito sa Pilipinas, may bahay din doon at sinamahan din siya for quite a while. We call him Tito Yulo of the Canlubang Estate together with his lovely wife. And they also stayed there for some time. and visited the Marcoses every so often. As a matter of fact, sometimes on a Sunday, the Mass was usually celebrated at their place. So whichever way it goes. So other than that, mostly they were the natives of Honolulu. Natives meaning yung mga old timers, OT ang tawag nga doon. I was telling you about the Ilocanos and so forth. Pero yung mga nanggagaling sa Pilipinas, naku, takot sila bumisita. Unang-una, kasi baka maimbestiga sila, baka sila mag-grand jury and all of that. At talagang sa airport pa lang, because when, for instance, my personal experience, pag bibisita ka at pag sinabing, what is your business here in Honolulu? So you would say, I'm visiting the Marcoses. Naku, hanggang sa, anong tawag dito, the hem of your dress or the hem of your pants, lahat tinitingnan. Kung baka may naipit ka dyan na papel o meron ka nilagay dyan na kung ano man. As a matter of fact, even your watch will have to be, you had to remove it and they would check it and find out baka meron mga device dyan or whatever. And they would look at, lalo na ako, I had a journal. So they would go over every page and read through it and find out baka merong code na nakasulat doon, baka merong anything that they could do. And at that time, I was already aware of this. So yung aking journal, for sensitive matters, like some reports I wanted to relay to the President or to Mrs. Marcos, I write it in Tagalog or in Bisaya or in Ilocano. And so it will take a while for those in the airport, the immigration, to go over this and to have it translated. So hindi nila maintindihan kung ano man yun. Whatever it is, that was how strict it was in the airport just to visit, the Marcoses. And that was the situation all the way until they left. Until Marcos died and until Mrs. Marcos had to stay in New York for the continuation of the trial against her. So that was it. Sabi ko nga, pag minsan masaya sapagkat maraming tao na bumibisita, pag minsan malungkot kung wala nang bumibisita at sila na lang andon. And I could imagine how they must have felt. Most of the time, President Marcos was in his room. Meron siyang malaking TV doon, malaking screen. And that was where he was watching the news and all of that. Sometimes they would eat at the lanai because the lanai, the dining room opens to a lanai, and you had the soft breeze that would come in. We had the late Father Santina, who also stayed with them for some years. He would say mass every day, and yun ang talagang something that perhaps not very many people know. The Marcoses had the celebration of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass every day. And they prayed the rosary every night after dinner. As a matter of fact, pag minsan nga, pag si President Marcos ang nagli-lead ng rosary, sumusobra na ng 10 Hail Marys. Pag minsan 15 na yung Hail Marys niya, so we had to remind him, Sir, Mr. President, glory be to the Father na whatever it is. And he memorized the novena to the Blessed Mother, the novena to the Sacred, and memoryado niya all of the accolades and all of the glories of the Blessed Mother. Memoryado niya the prayer to Saint Jude, memoryado niya yon. So even after the rosary, ang dami pa namin dinandasal, kakaantok-antok na, and he would be leading this. And he was surprised that sabi nga niya, you were educated in a convent school, you don't know this novenas and all of that. And Mrs. Marcos also had the Santo Niño there, yung dala niya pa niya galing dito sa Pilipinas. So it was the family home they had for several years. The children, Miss Aimee left soon after they landed in Hicam. I think she was not able to get into Honolulu anymore from Hicam Air Base, umalis na siya. Possibly on the instructions of President Marcos. Bit-bit niya yung kanyang baby at the time. They say that she first settled in Morocco because the King Hassan II was a very good friend, a family friend as a matter of fact. And from Morocco, she also settled in Portugal, where the brother of Mrs. Marcos was, si Bejo. And then from there, I think she was also traveling to Singapore, etc. and all of that. But the Senator Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, was there in Honolulu. He would uh, sometimes um, travel to San Francisco, but most of the time he stayed in Honolulu, especially since he was at the beck and call of his father. And he also assisted in reading all of those cases against them and so forth. So that was Bongbong. And some of his friends also joined him in Honolulu. To Miss Irene, well, the Aranetas, Greggy and his family had a house in San Francisco. It's a family home of the Aranetas, and that was where Irene was stationed. Two of her sons were with her, and I think they were also in nursery school at the time in San Francisco. Amy, the little girl who was still a little girl at the time, she schooled in the local international school in Honolulu. But every afternoon, President Marcos would call her after her classes to sit by his on the floor in front of him, and President Marcos would teach her Tagalog, Filipino. You would hear him saying, Tagalog words like all of this Himlayan and deep Tagalog words, so that she would not forget the the, the Tagalog language, the Filipino language, because yun na nga, nag-aaral sa international school, just a little girl at the time. And also meron din pamangkin, Mrs. Marcos, the late Tess Romualdez Marfori, anak na kapatid ni Mrs. Marcos, married to Joey Marfori. May both their souls rest in peace. He was a good friend of mine. She also eventually settled with them just to be able to take care of Mother Bellarmine, the sister of Mrs. Marcos, who also joined in when there was already the trial in New York. So yun ang kanilang buhay at bahay sa Honolulu. Sabi ko nga, napakaganda pero napakalungkot. For me, after having covered them in Malacanang, and then you see them in a different place under different circumstances, it really was, ang hirap. And sometimes when we were conversing, first time, as a matter of fact, in all the years that I've covered Malacanang, it was only in Honolulu for the first time that I sat at the dinner table with them to have either lunch or dinner with the president. He was in the cabecera, and I was on his left side, and Mrs. Marcos was in front of me. And sometimes there were just the three of us, or sometimes there were other guests also visiting. But most of the time, it was just us. And that was I would not exchange that opportunity for anything else, because that was the only time I had in all the years that I was covering them for television, that I was able to speak and talk to them, and as though they were just part of my family. We talked about everything. And President Marcos really had so many stories about his situation, but he was always worried about what was happening in the Philippines. When he was asking about several individuals who were hurt because of the rallies that were held, and then when he saw what Corazon Aquino was doing, especially when she started removing the local government officials without any law that governed it except her revolutionary constitution. And then when Marcos learned of all the rallies that were being staged by the loyalists, Marcos loyalists, every Sunday, as a matter of fact, and how they were being dispersed with tear gas and all. Kami yun, sa Luneta, every Sunday. O so many names that I've also mentioned. Pagka, and the video was being sent to President Marcos so that he could watch. Then he would ask, who are they? Sino itong mga taong ito? The anonymous masses. Yung mga galing sa Tondo, sa Payata, sa Cubao. So many of the recipients of the projects that they had sa mga bliss houses, sa dagat-dagatan, lahat ng yan. Yung mga nabigyan ng mga pabahay. And so, kahit na hindi man nakaabot sa kanila, pero kinikilala nila ang kanilang pagmamahal kay President Marcos. They were there in the rally. I think some of you are listening to me now, and some of you who may be abroad, if you had ever seen the rallies we had in the Luneta, talaga naman napakaraming tao. Anyway, so every once in a while, President Marcos would watch. And I would look at him, and sometimes you could see that he was misty-eyed in a way. And when I would ask him if how soon he would be returning to the Philippines, he would always say, yes, malapit na, always. He was always full of hope. that America would allow him to return. And he pleaded for this all the way with his lawyers here in the Philippines, all the way up to the Supreme Court. When his mother died, si Doña Josefa Edralin Marcos, Nana Sepa as he would call her, he also made the petition for him to be able to come home and, for the burial of his mother. When Elizabeth, his sister, also died, he also asked, petitioned also. And I said, all of these petitions were elevated all the way up to the Supreme Court. A basic human constitutional right to be able to return to your country of origin, that was denied of him. And with all the cases that they had in New York, exactly as I was mentioning in the past Rita Gadi hour that we've had, napakalungkot na sa araw-araw paggising niya, nakatambak na yung mga papeles sa harapan niya at binabasa niya lahat ng yun. Nakakapagtaka nga sa dinami-dami ng kanilang mga hinahanap at hinahalungkat para lang litisin sila sa Amerika. I've already mentioned that the cases in LA under this judge, the circuit judge in LA, si Mariana Felser, were all dismissed already all the way up to the 9th Circuit Court of LA for lack of evidence and for lack of merit. Mga RICO cases din yan. Sapagkat walang pagbabasihan, wala silang dokumento. Except, yun na nga, nabasa ko na sa inyo yung decision doon, except for newspapers, newspaper reports, yun ang kanilang pinresent sa 9th Circuit Appellate Court sa LA. And they had only one witness, a certain Fernando, testifying to the veracity that this is really a newspaper coming from the Philippines. Pero kung ano nakasulat doon at kung ano yung ebidensya na sinusulat doon sa mga dyaryo na yon, wala. They did not have it. They could not present anything. Kaya nga sabi ko, yun na lang sa New York ang kanilang pinagpatuloy sapagkat sa New York, andun yung 4 na buildings. Yung 4 na buildings na binili noong 1983, coming from the accounts from the Swiss banks. I have it here, I'll read it to you, yung mga buildings na yun, para malaman ninyo yung mga halaga at kung saan sila located. So those of you who may be in New York or maybe in America, you could look over these buildings again and see how beautiful these buildings are now and were at the time na binili yan sa New York City. Kaya nga doon na yung kaso doon final para sinasabi nga doon sa kaso na yon na yung pera na ginamit sa pagbili ng mga buildings na yon ay ninakaw sa taong bayan. Ito, 40 Wall Street. Sa Wall Street yan. Yan yung financial centers sa New York, sa Manhattan. 40 Wall Street. Yan ang pagka pinag-uusapan yung mga sa stock exchange, lahat na yan, the movement, the flow of money yan sa Wall Street yan. So number 40 dyan sa Wall Street. Magkano yan? $70 million. Yung Crown Building, $51 million. Yung isang bahay sa 200 Madison Avenue, $50 million. Malaki ito, parang ano ito, malaking building. And then you had the Herald Center, na Macy's na alam natin yun. Yung sa Herald Center, that was $17 million. So ang total, ng pera na bumili, ang total, how am I expressing myself in Tagalog so badly? The total amount was $188 million. And the money trail that was shown in New York during the trial was from the Swiss banks, nag-transfer sa LA banks, sa Redwood Bank sa LA, and from LA nag-transfer sa Philippine National Bank sa New York, at yung pera, yan ang ginamit para bilihin yung mga buildings na yan. Because at that time, bagsak nga yung real estate sa New York, and that was the best time na sinabi nga ng governor ng central bank to buy. But I've already mentioned this again, but we'll repeat this for those who perhaps did not hear it the first time. Sabi nga, doon sa pagbili ng mga buildings sa yon, sa trial sa New York, ang katanungan na mahalaga dyan ay saan nanggaling yung pera na pumasok dun sa Swiss banks na ginamit pagbili ng mga buildings na yan na binasa ko sa inyo. In other words, where is the source of those funds from the Swiss banks? Where did the money come from? That is the question that could not be answered. Hindi alam kung saan ang galing. Walang paper trail na meron dokumento na yung budget ng Pilipinas, na yun ang pera ng taong bayan, yun ang pumasok sa Swiss banks. Wala. Not even the Swiss documents from the Swiss banks na nagkaroon ng, sabi ko nga, ng memorandum of understanding between America and the Swiss government, wala silang ma-produce. The Swiss government could not produce the source of the funds that went into those accounts. Kaya, yun. Di alam kung saan ang galing at walang preba na ninakaw sa taong bayan, because that's a paper trail. From the budget, you could see, maglalabas sa appropriations. We just had now the completion of the discussions on the budget. It is now with the president. If you watch on television how they discuss, lahat talaga naka-itemize yan. Kaya kung meron lalabas na pera dyan, meron papel na magsasabi, ito pupunta sa building na yan, ito pupunta dyan. There was none that they could produce. So that's a question also that the judge was asking. The prosecution itself, the Justice Department of America, you bring this celebrated case into my courtroom, you accuse the wife of a former ally of the president and a friend of 5 presidents of the United States of America, and then you tell me, gee, we can't find the documents. Exact words ng judge. May G pa siya, gee, you can't find the documents. Ano ibig sabihin doon, they can't find the documents? Wala. Walang makitang dokumento. So all throughout that they were accusing Mrs. Marcos and President Marcos, they should have known, they should have known. May assumption. There is the presumption, but you can't do that because the RICO law, the violation of that law is a criminal offense. It had to be beyond reasonable doubt that you will prove that that person violated that law. So that was what they could not find. They could not find the documents that would link Philippine money to the purchase of those buildings. So that's the question again. Hanggang sa ngayon, nagnakaw si Marcos, he's a thief, etc. Yeah, ang daming pera. Can you imagine? I just gave you the summary. How many $1 million yung pagbili ng mga buildings na yun anyway? But there were no evidences that could be shown, even in that courtroom, with all the big governments, Switzerland, the Philippines, and America joining together for that particular case, that case in Foley Square, in the District Court of Judge John F. Keenan, whose wife, Diane Nicholson, was the classmate of Corazon Aquino at Mount St. Vincent in New York. Galing, no? Anyway, so that's how it goes. As I've said, President Marcos stayed in Honolulu until the last of his days. And then Mrs. Marcos left him for a while because she had to be indicted. That was October. Really, maginaw na yung panahon na in New York. But when she went back, doon na nag-umpisa na maghina yung health ni President Marcos. I think it was really more mental in a way that, that had his system collapsing and his organs going, weakening because his mind could not absorb the betrayal that was done to them by the United States of America, which was the cases that they filed against them. Kaya sabi ko nga, malungkot kahit na maganda yung kanilang tinitirahan, sapagkat yun ang tinanong ko kay President Marcos, do you have any regrets? Sabi niya, the betrayal of a friend, and that is the United States of America. Imagine, pagka nagkikwento siya, talagang ang gusto niyang pinag-uusapan yung kanyang yung gera, yung Second World War, kung saan lumaban siya in defense of our country and together with American soldiers. Yung sabi nga niya, our blood commingled in the fields of our country to defend our country. Binomba ang Honolulu, kasabay ng pagbomba. December 7, December 8, dito sa atin pagbomba sa Manila, binomba ang Honolulu ng Japan. That was the Second World War. And that was why, as I've said, malungkot kay President Marcos to have experienced the friendship over his over the timeline of his life, from the Second World War all the way up to the day that he gasped his last breath. Anyway, ganun ka ang nangyari. Kaya nung pagbalik ni Mrs. Marcos, kasi na-indict siya sa October, but that was only about a week that she was away. But I told you that scene, nung paalis na siya dun sa Makiki, President Marcos was in a wheelchair. Hindi nga siya makabiyahe na sa New York because otherwise he would have also been indicted in New York, but he couldn't travel anymore. Talagang nanghina na siya. As I've said, sa galing ng kanyang yoga at ng kanyang mental discipline, yung nangyari sa kanila, gawa ng mga kaso na yun, hindi na kayang ma-absorb ng kanyang utak. I remember, just to give you an incident, for instance, one example, kung paano yung kalakas ang isip niya, I would even quote Deepak Chopra saying that your mind is in every cell of your body. You can command your body to be healed, to behave, not to have a headache, not to have a stomachache, because your mind is in every cell. So, pag nagyo-yoga, o kaya yung tinatawang mind over matter, ganun yun. You can be able to guard your force, the force within, to be able to speak to your body. President Marcos was like that. He was meditative and he practiced yoga. One incident that I personally experienced, I was doing a coverage of him at the PICC, and then all of a sudden, akala ko pabalik na kami ng Malacanang kasi nagda-drive ako, kasunod ako ng kanyang convoy. Sabi ko, saan kaya pupunta? Sa Chinese General Hospital. Sabi ko, wow, bakit? May sakit ba si President Marcos? Bakit nila doon? Meron siyang kulugo. May wart sa daliri, sa one of his fingers, merong wart. And he wanted it removed. Natatanggal. Kaya doon sa Chinese General Hospital. I interviewed the doctor, I interviewed people there. Ganun pala yun. Tinanong niya, what are you going to do? How is the procedure? So sinabi, well, we will cut it, we will cauterize it, and we will remove it. So he went, nag-yoga siya and concentrated so that he will not feel the pain. Ganun katalas yung kanyang utak na kaya niyang makommand na hindi siya masasaktan. Okay, so they did the cauterizing. And then they heard him moan, aray, aray. He was, saying something like that. So after that, anyway, I thought, sabi ko nga, yung kanyang yoga, yung kanyang meditation, he would not feel pain. So after that incident, when he was already resting on one of the chairs there sa emergency room, I asked him, Mr. President, I thought you will not feel pain. And so sabi niya, kasi sinabi daw sa kanya, sa derma lang, kung saan lang yun, sa balat. Sabi niya, they should have told me that they were going to dig in my flesh. So yung kanyang concentration, para hindi niya maramdaman yung sakit, kailangan mas matindi pa yung kanyang concentration. That is an example I wanted to just explain, that malakas his mind was strong enough to be able to command his body, to behave, to not feel pain. But when the indictment came in Honolulu, and he saw that his wife would be traveling alone to be indicted in New York, bumagsak talaga yung kanyang pakiramdam sa pag-iisip na, yung sinabi nga niya kay Mrs. Marcos, I am supposed to be one of the best lawyers, but I could not even come to defend you at the time when you need it most to defend. Yun ang masakit. So anyway, I'm sharing that with you just to let you know so many of these incidents. Anyway, nakulang pas na ako ng oras. We are closing now our Rita Gadi's hour. Medyo mahaba na ito. So here it is. Good evening po, ma'am. This is from Rene. You are a living witness of the Marcoses and the true historian. That's why I've waited for this continuation of your last week. Yes. Good evening from Elmer Unite or Unite, however else pronounced. Malaking bulaklak ang Champaka. White, yes. Mabangong yan, yes. The Alice, good evening. Yes, good evening. Wherever you're located, thank you for having joined me. We will continue this sojourn to the past. As I've said, the presence of the past will always be with us. Lessons that we will learn, and of course, the memories that we hold sacred and we cherish for the rest of our lives. That was a beautiful era that we had, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, and we shall never forget this. That is the presence of our past. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi.